Hey, Stacy, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can see you. Quite a impressive backdrop you have behind you. I mean, most people just one platinum disc or record. There's a lot on there.
Yeah, it's actually a halo. That's and also that's my dog Max.
That's your dog, Max.
Yeah,
Well,
he has a habit that he developed over the last 4 or 5 months of needing to be on my lap during Zoom meetings.
well, if anything catastrophic happens, we will edit it out. But otherwise, how's your day going?
Day so far is pretty good. It's a beautiful day here in Tennessee. Where are you located, by the way?
Your old stomping grounds of Long Island, New York.
Where?
Long Beach?
Oh yeah, yeah.
The
It's,
the small world connection of the whole thing is that you're alumnus of Plainview, Old Bethpage High School, where my brother is the choir teacher. But I think, like me, your home high school program may not have been the best in recognizing your musical talent.
it was interesting. I don't know if you heard the story, but I actually was thrown out of the band program when I was in fourth grade.
Yes.
But later, once I took up the piano instead of the flute, which I could not make heads or tails of, then it changed, because then I was doing some accompanying work and actually was the accompanist of the high school choir when I was a senior. And then I started playing clubs when I was 15. So yeah, so it was definitely different. But yeah, my being flunked and being told by that teacher that I had no musical ability whatsoever has given me a strong mistrust of academics. So
I can imagine when I went to Belmore JFK, the other JFK on Long Island. It's a very interesting thing where the arts were not super embraced, yet a lot of people that I've went to high school with, I'm not going to say a lot as in 50, but I would say close to a dozen people I went to high school with have either made it to Broadway, they've sold a TV show, they've written for TV, they've done stand-up, yet those weren't necessarily people that were super embraced by the school for their talent back then. Were there other people that you went to high school with? And I know some famous people besides yourself who went to Plainview JFK who've made it, but did you go to school with other people who quote unquote made it?
yes, in particular, one who's still a good friend of mine, named Rod Morgenstein.
Oh, yeah, from
yeah,
Winger. Yeah.
yeah, from Winger, and before that, the Dixie Dregs and Dream Theater and a number of different things. And I think Rolling Stone rated him as the 17th greatest drummer in the world. And back then, he was a senior when I was a sophomore. But we ended up playing some, like little club dates together. And then also, can't remember if I was still in high school. It might have been my summer right after high school. We were in a semi-pro big band, jazz big band, that the lead trumpet player was our band director at Kennedy. But then also from Plainview, not from my high school, but from the other high school, Plainview-Old Bethpage High School, was Russell Javers,
Mm-hmm.
Doug Stegmeyer.
Yeah.
And they became key components in Billy Joel's band.
Yeah.
And matter of fact, the drummer, Liberty, who was from Seaford,
Yes.
he and I and a couple of other people used to play together as well.
Wow.
So the story was Liberty, Doug, Russell, and a guitarist that was originally in Billy Joel's band, but then dropped out because he was afraid to fly. A guy named Howie Emerson, who was a great guitarist, still is. They had a band on Long Island called Topper. And they used to play a club in Farmingdale. And I used to go to hear them there with friends of mine. And one day Billy Joel came in and ended up getting up on stage with them, did a few songs with them, and then on the spot hired them as his backup band. So they were really, really good. But yeah, that time there were a lot of great musicians bubbling around on Long Island. It was just an interesting time. But yeah, Rod is definitely he was a monster back then. He was, people were in awe of him. You know, he was an all-state band and, you know, everything that you could possibly do.
Ultimately taught at Berkeley. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Rod, I think on 2 occasions, and it cracks me up about, I like Winger, but Winger was much more prog than all of the other bands that they were lumped in with at the time. In other words, they had to super dumb it down, just the occasional time signature change and all that. And Rod, who was married for a long time to his childhood sweetheart, who I know he lost.
Michelle,
wonderful person as well, was so unlike all the other artists from that time, musicianship wise, being in a long-term relationship like that, knowing how to read music. It's almost like he was an actor playing the part.
Yeah, and then also being older than everybody else.
Oh.
So he was not significantly, but he was definitely the oldest in the band. It's funny because in the early 90s, I was living in Venice, California, and I was doing some sort of scoring work. I was working on some show, I can't remember, because that was my main business in LA, was scoring work.
Sure.
And my agent, Joel, called me, and he asked me just this funny question. And he said, "Do you know somebody named Rod Morgenstein?" And I said, "Yeah, where'd you pull that out from?" And he said, "Well, there's a guy sitting in my office who plays with Rod." And I said, "Who?" And he says, "Kip Winger." And he said, "Kip wants to learn more about scoring. Can the two of you get together?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So that's when I first met Kip. And then when I moved to Nashville, I was sitting at a bar, and I started talking to this guy who was sitting next to me named Paul Taylor.
Oh yeah, guitarist and Winger, yeah.
And no, Paul was keyboard player, and I think he also played guitar.
Yeah.
But he never mentioned Winger. He just said that he was on tour, he did this, and he was a musician. And then 2 weeks later, Rod called me and said, "Hey, I heard you met my buddy Paul." And I said, Paul who?" And he said, "You met him at a bar." And I said, "Oh, you mean Paul Taylor?" He said, "Yeah, he was in Winger." And I said, "Oh my God." And then I got in touch with Kip because he had moved here. And so we, would hang out, and I became friends with his now ex-wife, Paula.
Mm-hmm.
And, but yeah, it was just all these interesting interconnections. And with Rod, it went back even further because his sister was friends with my cousin. And Rod's father was one of my father's teachers when my father got out of the Marines and was in commercial art school. So it was just all these interconnections between the families.
There's so many directions I could take this, but you touched upon one of my favorite obsessive topics, which is that the whole LA metal scene of the late 80s, early 90s moved to Nashville. Every band, they're all in Nashville. When did that happen? Early 2000s?
I think early 2000s. When I first moved here, which was at the end of 2000. Yeah, I moved here toward the end of 2000. And, the general rule here in Nashville was there were rock and roll people living here, but no rock and roll band could get broken from Nashville, could break out from Nashville.
Yeah.
That changed. First off, Kings of Leon, who was from Nashville, they had a successful career in the UK, but then they started breaking out in the US too. And that kind of changed things. Then Jack White moved here.
Yeah.
Paramore, a homegrown band out of Franklin, Tennessee, hit it big. Great lead singer. And all of a sudden, all these rock and roll people were moving here. And but there was also, before that, a huge exodus from LA to Nashville in 1994 and 95. And that was because in 92 in LA, we had the riots.
Mhm.
In 93, we had the Malibu fires and then the mudslides. And in 94, we had a major earthquake. And that's when a lot of people just said, forget it. I'm not staying here anymore. I called them quitters. I said, I call those the 3 fun years in LA.
Yeah, it seems like everywhere you go, you find your scene. So you had your Long Island scene that you grew up around because you were in the Musicians Union as a teenager. I believe
Right.
it's 802, AFM 802 or something like that.
Yeah, local 802.
Then you go to Venice, you find your footing there. It sounds like you were in Venice before it was safe and cool. You were there first when Dennis Hopper was still making it edgy.
Yeah, well, the first part of LA I lived in was in the Wilshire Fairfax area. First in a really terrible apartment with my girlfriend, Wendy Fraser, who's the woman that sings on She's Like the Wind.
Yes.
And, we moved from New York together. But within a year or so, we found a much better apartment down the block. And I was in that neighborhood actually about 9 years. But then also in 1988, after the success of Dirty Dancing and She's Like the Wind, I bought a house up in Lake Arrowhead in the mountains, which was my first home that I bought.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of splitting my time between those 2 places. And then Patrick Swayze and his wife, Lisa, visited me up there a few times, and they ended up buying their own place up there. And so it was always fun because we used to hang out together on our boats in the middle of the lake. And anyway, those were fun times as well. But yeah, I mean, in LA, it's a very tough place.
Yeah.
But Wendy and I moved to LA with a credit in hand already, which was while we were in New York, we had co-written the theme for the Richard Simmons show.
Yes.
And that we figured could be leverage into the business, and that actually proved to be the case.
Right. So it's this interesting thing where you're a lifer in music. Your credits don't necessarily connect the way that if you said Bruno Mars, he's written this, this, and this, and it's all in the same basket in a way. But
Right.
You've been very successful for a long time. And you're not the first Dirty Dancing co-writer or songwriter that I've spoken with, because I spoke with Frankie and John recently.
Right.
I assume that you know them through events and all that over the years. But it's interesting that you're all in the same boat of you have this one credit that, without saying any numbers, sustains you or can sustain you for a long time and all that. So you don't have to hustle the way that a lot of other songwriters would per se, but I'm sure you don't want to just sit back and go, yes, that was our one thing and that's it.
Well, again, for me, what's different from Frankie and John was that, like I said, my main business was really scoring work,
Right.
Picture. So that's a whole different business. And that I became really active in that in the, starting around 1990, I focused back on that. And it seemed like everything my agent put me up for, I got. And so, like, in a period from 1995 to 1999, I think it was, I scored 21 movies of the week for the networks. And that was a lot. I did 9 in 1 year.
Wow.
And, yeah. So by that point, I was living in Malibu, fortunately, so that I could go outside and clear my head and, lie in the pool for a half an hour and look at the mountains and the ocean. But that was a very intense business to be in. So that's a whole different. And what's great about those TV movies is there was one series of movies called Moment of Truth movies and another series called Crimes of Passion movies. And Disney ended up buying both of those franchises and distributed them worldwide. So I see, okay, they played this movie in France and I get, $4,000, or they played this movie in Spain and Germany, and for some reason they have this popularity overseas. And then I also worked on Beverly Hills 90210, which plays all over the world. And so it's when I get my BMI royalty statements, it's like, it's my life.
Yeah.
Because even the Richard Simmons show occasionally shows up, not from the show itself, but an episode of Saturday Night Live with Eddie Murphy. He played a character called Little Richard Simmons, which was a combination of Richard Simmons and Little Richard. And for his play on and play off music, they used the theme that Wendy and I wrote. So that still shows up, like $3.50, but it's great. And then it was also used in the movie Moscow on the Hudson with Robin Williams.
Oh yeah. I'm familiar with that movie.
Yeah. So it's just interesting when I look through and I was like, God, this is something I wrote in 1980 and it's showing up on the royalty statement.
That's fantastic. It's really interesting. The word interesting gets overused, but I'm going to put you in that interesting category. That when you have somebody who everyone has heard your music, whether or not they realize it, everyone has heard your music in some form, whether they were watching TV, they went to the movies, it was on the radio, etc. Did you ever have that urge to kind of push yourself out forward and go, look, it's me? Or did you just go, hey, as long as the checks are coming and as long as there's something to do, I'm thrilled?
Well, I always say that I was blessed with the inability to sing because that didn't give me the drive to be a star.
Yeah.
And I think I concentrated on the craft part of it, the business part of it, because I was very active in terms of making business decisions as well with my attorney. But it still is nice. There's that moment when somebody says, when you tell somebody that you're a composer, songwriter, they immediately think, well, what do you really do?
Yeah.
And so I even had a woman at a graduation party for my cousin's son. It was his aunt on the other side of the family, and I'd never met her. And she said, you live in Nashville? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, what do you do there? And I said, well, I've always been a composer and songwriter. And she said, that's what you do for a living. And then she gave me my favorite question was, well, have you written anything I would know? And so just as a sidebar, my cousin's son, graduating high school, had decided to go to film school, and he was really talented. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to be at his graduation. Mm-hmm. And anyway, so I told her, I wrote She's Like the Wind. And her eyes kind of went, and she said, wait, I've heard that song. You mean the song that's from the radio and I said, yeah, from Dirty Dancing. I co-wrote that. And so then I leaned into her and I said, some of us make a living at this. And that's why I'm here to support Matthew, because he needs to know that some of us make a living at this.
That brings everything full circle to what we were talking about before, where a lot of people I went to school with, it was kind of like, oh, you want to be an actor or whatever. That's great. Well, you could do that on the side from when you're teaching. And you were one of those examples of the guy said he was going to do it, did it during high school when probably everyone else was out partying a little more, or maybe just playing football in the backyard. You were actually putting in your time and playing the gigs at night and still making it to school. But are you aware of, besides you and Rod, a lot of other famous-ish people that have come out of Plainview JFK?
There's a well-known critic who he changed his name to John Powers, mm-hmm. And sort of semi-famous, a comedy writer named Gary Apple.
Yeah. And
Gary actually co-wrote a very famous episode of The Simpsons where Homer has a heart attack. And then Gary lived in LA for a little bit. And we were in touch back in LA.
Mhm.
Interestingly, the way we got back in touch, because he and I co-wrote and co-directed the Senior Follies when we were seniors in high school, which was kind of like the comedy spoof of high school life.
Mhm.
And we had a brand new principal named Mr. Gleim. And so the entire first act was based on the New Testament, and Gleim was the Messiah. And it was actually a pretty funny show. Gary enjoyed the experience so much that that's why he became a comedy writer. But then we completely lost touch. He didn't come to any of the reunions or anything. And I was sitting in my house in Venice, and the phone rang, and an old friend of mine from high school lived in the high desert in LA. And there was a call-in show on KABC radio, the Peter Tilden show.
Mhm.
So my friend Scott called me and said, hey, turn on KABC. There are two comedy writers on there that are partners, and one says his name is Gary Apple, and I wonder if it's the same one. So I'm listening, and I said, it sounds like him. And again, I hadn't spoken to him for almost 20 years.
Mhm.
So I said, I'm going to hang up. I'm going to call in. So I called in and I got on the air. And I said, yes, I have a question for Gary Apple. Are you from Plainview, Long Island? And so then there was this pause, and he said, yeah, who's this? And I said, this is Stacy Widelitz. And he said, oh my God, it's Stacy, she's like the wind, Widelitz. He had been following what I was doing.
That's great.
So Peter Tilden immediately chimed in and says, what do you mean she's, and so Gary Apple said, this guy wrote She's Like the Wind. And so Peter Tilden said, how much money did you make from that? And I said, I don't discuss that on the air. And, but then Gary and I just started chatting, and Peter Tilden finally cut us off and said, I just want to thank you both for using a $50 million radio facility for a personal phone call. So it was very funny, but that's how we got back in touch.
That's fantastic. Well, the director and writer Mark Lawrence went to Plainview JFK, and he's made a lot of movies.
Yeah.
Hugh Grant. There's a really famous professional wrestler who's on weekly television named Max Friedman, or Maxwell Jacob Friedman, who gets introduced to the ring as being from Plainview, Long Island, and he says it's the best place on earth. So I guess some people have a different take on it. And there's a famous rapper named Hoodie Allen who also went to that school.
Hoodie Allen, that's great.
So you might have been the first to kind of make it out, and you might have inspired some of these people and showed them, hey, a guy from Plainview JFK made it.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how many people in Plainview know of that, because, I moved to LA when I was 25 years old. So, but yeah, who knows? Who knows?
A random 90210 question, putting you on the spot here. I'm curious if you ever heard this. I heard a rumor that the original theme song or cue music for the show was supposed to be Just Like Paradise by David Lee Roth, but for some reason they never heard back and that didn't happen. Did you ever hear that rumor?
No, but it's very possible. But the original opening theme for the pilot, and I think if you look on YouTube, you can still find it. The original opening theme for Beverly Hills 90210 was written by me and Jeff Skunk Baxter.
What? You and Skunk?
Yeah, but Jeff and I had been introduced, and we became fast friends, and I'm still good friends with him. And matter of fact, if you listen to the saxophone, that's Edgar Winter on saxophone,
who also played with David Lee Roth, which is the small nature of it all. Now that era, if you're saying the pilot of 90210 would have been when Skunk was doing the band called The Best, right? He had an all-star band with John Entwistle.
Yeah, they were touring, especially in Japan. It was like an all-star band. And, yeah, and then he and I scored a couple of other TV shows together that were not very good, but it was always fun working with him. And he's a whole story by himself because of his intelligence work that he does. He's an intelligence officer. So, but yeah, we became very good friends like right away because we both loved history, the English language, and Scotch. So it was it was a match made in heaven for us. And one of the great joys that I had, he asked me to. He was putting together a pickup band for a singer named Terry Garrison, and Jeff asked me to play piano in it. Mm-hmm. But also he knew that I could write up the charts because Terry's music was all over the place and she had nothing written down. And I just sat in Jeff's living room. She played and I just wrote down the chords because I have perfect pitch. So I knew what she was singing. And, but we played a bunch of shows for her at the China Club, which was mm-hmm. the hot club in LA at the time. And it was an absolute blast because we would rehearse once, then go up on stage the next day. And great drummer, Joe Pusateri, and it was just so much fun. Those shows were great. And they were packed, like 500 people in the room. And then downstairs in the China Club was the celebrity center called the Dragon Room. And because I was playing there and I got to know the manager and everything, and I'd go down into the Dragon Room and Rod Stewart would be down there and all these different people. So it was a really fun time.
You have almost like a Forrest Gump kind of story where we can't go, well, Stacy is an 80s guy, and we can't go, well, Stacy's a 90s guy, because a lot of people, they would just be talking about that one credit forever. And we can't pigeonhole you as the composer for film and TV, or the soundtrack guy, or the session player, or the arranger. It just never ends. How do you like to be thought of in general? Do you like to be pigeonholed or described a certain way?
No, I actually hated it. And it's something I fought against in LA because they want to pigeonhole you there.
Sure.
And I, as a matter of fact, in the early 90s, I was doing episodic. I was doing 90210. I did a bunch of episodes of a show called Erie, Indiana, which was actually my favorite show to do. I did a cartoon series for ABC. But my agent kept trying to get me what they called long form TV, which were TV movies. Mm-hmm. And I would constantly be turned down because they say, oh, he does episodic. He doesn't do long form. And that's ridiculous because it's the same process. And I scored some movies in the 80s. And so finally, I met with a producer, Michael O'Hara, and he gave me a shot at one of his movies. And then I ended up doing 18 or 19 movies with him. We just had he liked what I did. And we had a fun working. He was from Queens, so we understood each other, I think.
That's a really interesting thing. And again, that word interesting comes up when it comes to the relationship between TV and film. Nowadays, you'll see big movie stars doing series or limited run kinds of shows, whereas it would be almost like you're a big movie star. You will never do TV until your career is over. And now we see people going back and forth happily. They go from film to TV, back to film, back to TV. And then they're simultaneously producing a TV show while they're a movie star. So you were doing that first, right?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I was really, my goal in scoring was to do A-level movies. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't panning out because in the late 80s, a trend started happening that rock stars were being hired to do film scores. That's how Hans Zimmer got in.
Yes. Eddie Van Halen did some of that. On and on. What's his name? Anyway, that a lot of people, Trevor Horn started doing some scoring. And so it's one of the reasons why my agent was introducing me to some rock stars, was to maybe we can, get something worked out. That's why I was introduced to Jeff Baxter. One of my
favorite stories with meeting somebody from the rock world was I was working on the show Erie, Indiana for NBC. And because that show was like a cross between the Twilight Zone and the Wonder Years. And so I could be very imaginative with the scoring, really, a lot of sci-fi, interesting harmonic things. And, it was a really fun show. So I was working on it, and I was still living in my old apartment at this point. I had the place in Arrowhead by this time. And my agent called me and said, I've got a guy sitting in my office who's from the rock world, and he wants to learn something about scoring. And while you're working on Erie, would it be okay if he comes over to your place to watch you work? And I said, I don't know, Joel, it's kind of a solitary thing. It'd be weird to have somebody in the room with me. And I said, who is it? And he said, it's Ray Manzarek.
Yeah.
And I was a huge Doors fan, especially the second album.
Yeah.
And so Ray Manzarek of the Doors wants to come to my apartment to watch me work. And Joel said, yeah. And I said, okay. So I think it was a couple of days later, Ray came over, and he was incredibly nice and very, he would occasionally ask a question. And then at one point I said, I'm going to take a break. Why don't we go into the living room and I'll make some tea. So we're sitting in the living room and we were talking about the upcoming Oliver Stone movie, The Doors, which Ray had his name taken off of because he felt it was inaccurate.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're talking, just peer to peer. And at one point I looked at him and I said, okay, you have to give me 30 seconds. And he said, what? And I said, just give me 30 seconds. And he said, okay. And I looked at the floor and I said, I can't believe Ray Manzarek is in my apartment. I can't believe Ray Manzarek is in. I said that about 5 times, and I looked at him and I said, okay, I'm done. So he just started laughing, and he came over a couple of times, but then I ran into him at the big music store in LA, which had a good pro section, was West LA Music. That's where I bought my gear, and I knew the manager there, and I was in there to buy some cables or something. So I'm on this line for the main counter.
Sure.
And I hear this buzz, hearing Ray Manzarek. So I turn, and there in the doorway is Ray with the manager. Ray sees me, and he points at me, and he yells out into this crowded room, get that man some service. That man is a genius. Like this. So everybody's looking at me, and I'm standing there like kind of like, okay, now what? But it was a very nice moment. He was a very gracious guy.
So intriguing, again, that happens here, but I think we're on the same wavelength about the Doors. When you think about that band was together with Jim Morrison for 4 to 5 years. All that happened in 4 to 5 years. And then there's been like 45 to 50 years of just licensing and cultural relevance.
Yeah.
And it still sounds totally fresh. Jim Morrison is still shocking for what he was doing and saying all these years later. And Ray's keyboard playing still sounds great. It doesn't sound dated so that you hear it and you go, 60s. Now, I can't say that about the album Other Voices and the work thereafter, the Butts Band.
Right.
But man, it's kind of like the first 4 Doors records, the first 3 Van Halen records. Certain things are just timeless. And
yeah. The other band that to me is one of my absolute favorite bands from the 1960s was Moby Grape.
Sure.
Their first record. And I remember actually sitting in Baxter's studio, and the phone rang, and he was talking for a little bit. And I said, who was that? And he said, it was Skip. So I said, Skip who? And he says, Skip Spence.
Right.
So I said, Skip Spence of Moby Grape was on the phone? And he said, and he looked at me, and Jeff said, I'm telling you this, that was the greatest rock and roll band of all time. And so they were the first to have 3 front guitarists, all of whom were fantastic. The high stacked harmonies. They're just a great, great band.
For sure. Well, we've been talking about the past, and the past, but I haven't asked you about what you're working on now, or if there's a cause or anything you want to promote. So the floor is all yours, Stacy.
Well, one of the interesting unexpected paths that kind of revealed itself when I moved to Nashville was in 2004, I'd written the score for a dance film that Patrick and Lisa Swayze did. That was based on a stage piece that we all worked on in the 1980s. And so I wrote a bunch of the dance music, scored some of the dramatic scenes. And it got entered into Nashville Film Festival, which I had no connection with whatsoever. And it was accepted. Then they found out that the composer was local. So they asked if I wanted to do a panel on film composing. So I said, sure. Then I got a call from Patrick, whom I knew as Buddy. They said, well, since it's in the festival and you're there, we're thinking of coming to the festival. If we do, can we stay with you? So I said, yeah, sure. So they came out for the festival, and I said, you know, as long as you're doing that, why don't you be on this panel with me? Because then we can make it about how music in film is a collaborative effort. And the panel was packed, you know, sold out because it's not for me. And it was
possibly,
yeah, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
it went really well. And then I ended up winning the Best Music Award at the festival, and I didn't even know I was in competition, so I didn't go to the awards. But a couple of the board members that I had gotten to know asked me if I wanted to join the board. And so I thought, I've never been on an arts board, sure. So I joined the board, and I unfortunately showed organizational skill. And by 2007, I was the board president. And I served as the board president for 2 years. And it was really a fun experience. The closing night film for the 2008 festival was The Wrecking Crew, about the great musicians in LA. So we put on a concert for the closing night party. We flew in some members of the Wrecking Crew and combined them with local musicians that I'd become friendly with. And we put on this great show with Kim Ritchie singing These Boots Are Made for Walking and stuff like this. It was just great. Anyway, I had also joined the board of a group called Alias Chamber Ensemble, which was kind of a cutting edge classical group. Then in 2011, I became their president, and I served as their president from 2011 to 2015. 2007, I went through a great program here called Leadership Music. And I joined their board in 2010 and then became their president in 2017. And then around that time also, I got recruited for the board of Nashville Opera. And, or 2015, yeah, right after I left Alias. And then in 2018, I became their board president. And so, and now I'm board president of the Nashville Opera Guild, which is kind of the education fundraising side. So all these leadership, on top of that, I got involved in local politics back in 2014. In 2015, I was appointed to the Planning Commission of the city of Oak Hill, where I live. And then in 2016, I ran for commissioner and won. And so I served as commissioner for 4 years. So as I like to say to people, I'm a goddamn elected official. So, and I used to get mail to the Honorable Stacy Widelitz, and I'd chuckle. And so anyway, that's been quite unexpected and very gratifying to have that reputation in town. And it's plugged me into the arts world here enormously, where I know, you know, every head of every arts organization. And then a funny thing happened in 2015, which is an ongoing, brand new thing for me, which was I flew to Italy to participate in a songwriter workshop in a villa in Tuscany, which I know sounds terrible. And
No, I mean there's versions of that here in the States. That I know the terrible thing was a little bit of a sarcastic thing, but that is amazing that it's in Italy versus
yes,
just some abandoned campgrounds in Pennsylvania. I
yeah,
think all those retreats, songwriting retreats. So keep going there, please.
yeah. And I went as a student because the teacher was Gretchen Peters, who's one of my favorite songs. And I wanted to work on writing by myself rather than always collaborating on songwriting, and wanted to focus on that. But a week before the trip, I bought a new, better camera than I'd been using when I traveled. And I found out that the camera had a black and white function. And I started taking pictures of people in black and white because I loved classic street photography and film noir, all that. And a photographer, a friend of mine, saw some of the photos that I'd posted on Facebook and basically said to me, you need to keep doing this because they're really good. So I did. I went on any trip that I did, which was a trip to Cuba, a couple of trips to DC, then back to Italy, New Orleans, then back to London and Italy, back to the same villa in Tuscany, but this time just to visit. And I just wandered around taking pictures in Lucca and Siena and all these places. And when I came back from that trip, that was in the spring of 2018, I decided to get a couple of pictures printed professionally to see what they looked like because I'd only seen them on a computer. So I was told by my photographer friend where to go to get the prints done. And I had these two photos printed out at like 11 by 17, I think, something like that. And when I went to pick them up, they were on this cloth paper. I mean, really well done. The woman that runs the place, called Chromatics, turned to me and said, "Did you take these pictures?" And I said, "Yeah." "Why?" And so she said, "They're really good. Do you have more like this?" And I said, "Yeah, I actually have a ton." So she said, "You need to go around the block to Plaza Arts, buy a photo portfolio and start printing more and put together a portfolio because you're onto something." So I did. And then I showed them to the artistic director of a facility here called Oz Arts. And she said, "You need a show of your own on the Avenue of the Arts in downtown Nashville." And so I said, "Well, I know Ann Brown down there who owns the Arts Company," which was one of the first and biggest art galleries in. So she said, "You've got to show these to Ann." So I called Ann. She was dubious at first, but then I emailed her some photos. And then she said, "Let's set a meeting." And ultimately that turned into me getting a show at her gallery, a one-man show. And from that show, 3 pieces sold, which I couldn't believe. And not like, $50, but like $1,800 a piece. And then Ann retired. Arts Company became Chauvet Arts, new management. They told me they wanted to continue to represent me. And another one of my photos in their possession just sold 2 weeks ago. And then 2 days ago, last week I was invited to join a Facebook group called Inspired Street Photography. And it's 89,000 people belong to this from all over the world. You have to be invited. And you can post a photo a day or every other day or once a week on their site. And then they have curators that will name their 4 best of the month in various categories. And so I joined the group. The next day posted a photo. And then 2 days later, that photo was chosen as one of the 4 best of the month. And that was stunning to me. And they put a thing on their Instagram gallery. And it really was a, kind of a shot in the arm, like, okay, these are guys that's been doing this a long time, and they've recognized something that I'm doing. And then, also that my work is hanging in people's homes someplace. So that's been a really, really unexpected journey, and one that is really fun, because weirdly, I feel more of it like an artist as a photographer than I do as a musician, because music to me was a commercial enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just a pure means of self-expression that people happen to like. So it's been very, very funny thing. If you go to my website, you can see a lot of the photography.
And also more about the organizations that you mentioned, also listed on
Yeah.
the website. I did my research. I just figured coming from you, then the people will go there. But let's recap what we've learned. Essentially, you can't pin down Stacy to being just one thing or just one era, which is an amazing thing. Stacy is a better Rolodex than you do, or address book, or whatever you want to call the place where you put all your contact information. It's a long-term career that's not slowing down anytime soon, that spanned multiple cities. And he's given back a lot, not just writing, but also serving on local organizations and through government. I mean, hey, that's a lot to say. That's a lot to process. But most of my interviews don't involve that great third act. And I'm not going to say it's the third act of 3. It could be the third act of 4. But most of those stories don't have that.
Yeah, it's funny. My gallery show in 2019 was called Second Act. And so it was great to walk in and see my photos up on the wall, and then on the wall, Second Act, with my name underneath it. And it was, that it was an obvious choice. But yeah, it's strange. I don't know, exactly how these things happen, but I think that one of my mottos at this point is to expect the unexpected.
In the best of ways. Well,
in the best of ways, because you just don't know. And it's funny, when I ran for office, one of my friends here said, doesn't politics scare you? And I said, I was in the entertainment industry for 19 years in LA. This doesn't scare me. So
well, I can't thank you enough for your time. Best places for people to find you online besides your website? Is there a social media account or 2 that they should be looking at?
Yeah, they can follow me on Instagram, where I post my black and white photos, from past or recent. I posted one from our snowstorm that we had of my dog wandering in the snow. And so that's just at Stacy Widelitz, one word. No E in Stacy, by the way. And then my website is stacywidelitz.com. Facebook, it's more, I promote stuff that the opera's doing, things like that, and post snarky comments and things like that. But if they really want to follow what I'm doing in terms of work, it's the website and Instagram.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to everything that's coming in the future from you, man.
Thanks, Darren. This was great.
Paltrocast.